Okay, welcome to the program. What's Southern about Texas Jewry and what's not? My name is Kenneth Hoffman. I am the director of the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. We're a museum that is not yet open. Here, let me get back to me for a sec. There we go. Hey guys, this is me right here. So we're not open yet, but we will be open in the first quarter of 2021. We had originally hoped to open in October of this year, and then something came up. You know, the thing that came up. That's everyone's worried about. So we had to delay a little bit, but here, look, I'm going to spotlight me. Now you have to see me. But we don't have to be an open museum in order to do lots of things that museums do, like public programming like this, like collecting artifacts and stories, which we're doing, planning for exhibits, which we're doing. We're getting our building ready. And of course, we're fundraising, but not tonight. So don't worry about it. I joked earlier that I was going to solicit everybody on here, but I'm not. You're gonna love this program so much that I just know what you're gonna do afterwards. So this is the way it's gonna work tonight. I'm gonna introduce the museum. I'm gonna show you a few slides and talk about a little bit about what the museum is hoping to do and what our mission is. And then I'm gonna turn it over to Josh, and he's gonna tell you about the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice. And then Josh and I are going to have a little conversation about Jews in Texas, what makes them special, what makes them just like everyone else. And then we're going to open it up to questions. And if you want, you can also text, or not text, you can, on the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can type in a question to me. We may not get back, to everybody. I don't know how many questions we'll get, but that's what's going to happen. So let me go ahead and share my screen. We'll get back to this PowerPoint. Whoops. Well, that didn't work. Hold on a second. There we go. All right, so here's my title screen, the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, and you can see from our logo that right in the word Southern is Jewish, right? We use a Star of David as the O, Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. Our tagline, the kind of museum we want to be is a hospitable place. So we say shalom, make yourself at home. Shalom, y'all, gets a little bit overused, and so we wanted to have our own tagline. But so before we start talking about the museum, I want to warm you guys up with a quiz. So this is a Texas Jewish pub quiz, and if you've got a glass of wine, if you've got a glass of tequila, if you've got a Shiner Bock nearby, go ahead and enjoy it, and we're going to answer I'm going to ask you some questions, and let's see. So question 1, who was the rabbi who oversaw the Galveston Plan that brought 10,000 Jewish immigrants through Texas from 1907 to 1914? Was it Hank Greenberg, Henry Cohen, or Henry Winkler?
Henry Cohen.
Yeah, who said that? I can't see who's talking, so.
Diane Statham.
All right, you win. You get the first prize, which is great. There's 2 more prizes to get. There we go. That's the answer. Next question. Jewish Texas pioneer Jacob de Cordova laid out which city in 1848 selling 1-acre lots for $5? Was it Odessa, Kerrville, or Waco?
Waco.
All right.
From the heart.
We got lots of correct answers there. So obviously we got some smarties on the line, which is great. And question 3, who is this pioneer of fashionable ladies ready-to-wear? Is it Carrie Marcus Neiman, Sophie Bloomingdale, or Ruth Amazon.com?
Carrie Marcus Neiman.
Okay, you guys are, I think that I'm not gonna have anything to tell y'all tonight. I think y'all are gonna be telling me a lot of things about Texas Jewry because you seem to know a lot already. Congratulations. But what we're talking about tonight is, are the Jews in Texas, what is their identity? How do they identify themselves? How do other people identify them? What is the South? A lot of people have different ideas of what the South are. Our museum covers 13 states. We cover Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, even all the way down to South Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and there's one more, I can never remember the last one. Oh, that's right, Louisiana, where the museum is being built in New Orleans. So this is our definition of the South. Other people have other definitions. Some would include Maryland. Some would not include Oklahoma. Some would not include necessarily Kentucky. Some might include Missouri. There's no right or wrong answer to this, but these are the 13 states that the museum covers. Now, here is a picture of our building. If you've been to New Orleans before, this building is very close to where the World War II Museum is. We don't have the whole building. Our museum will be on the ground floor and half of the second floor. It's about 13,000 square feet. And while the building is being renovated, we still have the option to lease half of the third floor, which I'm really hoping to do, but that will raise our rent. And so it all depends on you know what. So here is a picture from our roof. So again, if you know New Orleans, if you know downtown New Orleans, then you'll get a sense of where we're located. We're very close to Lee Circle. We are very close to the World War II Museum and the Ogden Museum of Southern Art and the Contemporary Arts Center and the Mississippi River Bridge. So we're we're in a wonderful part of town for tourists as well as for locals. We're on the streetcar line and the hop-on, hop-off tourist bus if tourists ever start coming back to town. So that's where we're at. The building is 104 years old, so it's getting a complete renovation, but we're maintaining as much of the old brick and the beams in the ceiling to give it a wonderful historical feel.
Washing machine.
And this is just a layout, sort of a basic floor plan. Here is our lobby entrance where you will enter. This is our theater where you will see a brief orientation film that we're making right now. Our first gallery covers the 18th and 19th centuries, well, a little bit of the 17th century too. Our second gallery is all about Judaism and what Judaism is, because this museum is not just for Southern Jews or Jews in general. This museum is going to be for everyone. And there's a lot of people who don't know much about the Jewish
It's not
religion.
there yet.
And so they will. Hey, go ahead and mute yourself if you are not me.
Sharon, mute yourself, Sharon.
And this is our third gallery, which will cover the 20th century. Things like how Jews in the South encountered and reacted to the Holocaust, the civil rights movement, the transformations of the smaller towns, the loss of populations in the smaller towns, and the growth in the larger cities. And then finally, we want everyone to leave, of course, through the gift shop. Some renderings from our wonderful exhibit designers. They're called Gallagher and Associates, and they're the same folks that did the exhibits at the World War II Museum and the National Museum of American Jewish History, and lots of other places around the country and around the world. What you're seeing are renderings, which means when you actually come into the museum, it will not look like this. These are early drawings of conceptual things, of conceptual timelines. We will be talking about all of our past. some of which is less celebratory, let's say. So we're going to talk about Jews in the Civil War. We're going to talk about Jews owning slaves. We're going to talk a lot about Jews as merchants, because a lot of Southern Jews started out and remain merchants, starting as peddlers, opening small dry goods stores across the South. Some of them turning into large stores, large department stores that started in the South and then moved across the country. You'll notice this medal down here, which is from the Sanger brothers. Has anyone heard of the Sanger brothers?
Yes.
The Sanger brothers, of course, were a great Texas family of merchants and civic leaders, and they even built schools for the families of their workers. And this was one of their citizenship awards that is in our collection. And this will actually be in the exhibits. Here's our gallery all about Judaism, or at least a rendering of it. And we have sourced images of stained glass from synagogues across the South, which will be hanging from the ceiling with lights, shining on them. So it's going to be not only educational, but also very beautiful in this gallery. Our third gallery, covering the 20th century, the Jewish feelings, the Southern Jewish feelings about Zionism, the Southern Jewish feelings about efforts to get people out of Europe before and during World War II. And we're going to talk about those Holocaust survivors who moved to the South. You don't have to be from the South, 5, 6, 7 generations to be a Southern Jew. If you survived the Holocaust and you came and made a new life for yourself in Dallas or in El Paso or in Midland or in Houston or in Beaumont, then you are a Southern Jew. And so we're going to have opportunities to explore their lives. And we're going to talk about the transformations, the loss of the small towns. And I'm sure you all know people who were once in small towns where the Jewish community was somewhat vibrant, but they've over time gotten smaller and smaller as people left to live in the bigger cities. For everything we don't cover in the museum, you're going to get to explore on our state-by-state maps, which means you're going to get to sit down at a console and you're going to get to explore the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. You're going to get to explore by state, by city, by artifact. So we're very excited about this. And our final exhibit is going to be something that talks about identity and community. This is a beautiful crazy quilt that will be on display. It was made in Canton, Mississippi in 1885. And it represents a coming together of the Jewish community in Canton in order to raise money, because they auctioned this off, to build a synagogue. And so we have an interactive where people are going to be doing some quilting, not with an actual needle and thread. It's all done electronically, but it's going to be really fun and interactive. We have a second floor, which has a changing gallery. It has a classroom space, and of course it has office space as well. And that's it. That is my, I'm gonna stop sharing. That is my introduction to the museum. I probably went a couple minutes over what I told Josh I would, but I wanted to make sure everyone had an idea of what the museum was all about and what we hope to accomplish. We want Jews to come in. We want non-Jews to come in. We want Southerners. We want non-Southerners. We want people from all over the world to come and hear our stories, because when most people think about Jewish immigration or even just Jewish communities in the United States, what do they first think about? Ellis Island, the Lower East Side, New York, that story of Jewish America, which is a wonderful and vibrant and great story, but it's not the only story. And so the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience is here to make sure that our stories get told. All right, that's it. That's my spiel. I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and I'm going to let him tell you about the Jewish History Archive. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Kenneth, for that introduction and for the opportunity to spend an evening together. Obviously, we had hoped to maybe do this live in New Orleans at the museum, and hopefully in 2021 we'll have the opportunity to do that. It's also just a really exciting time in the field of Southern Jewish history. There's so many organizations and institutions doing good work, from the Southern Jewish Historical Society to the Texas Jewish Historical Society, to your museum, and I'm grateful that our archive is a part of just a really exciting moment in the field of the study of the Southern Jewish experience. So what I want to do for just a couple of minutes, as Kenneth did, is give those of you who are hearing about the Houston Jewish History Archive for the first time a quick, and I will try to be quick, introduction to who we are and what we do. And here we are. So this was a project that officially launched in 2018, and in large part, it was a reaction to the effects of Hurricane Harvey on Houston and South Texas. And the fact that at the time, there was very little work being done on the ground to collect and preserve historical artifacts about Jewish life in Houston and the South Texas area. And it became very apparent after the flood that if we didn't take action right away to rescue papers and artifacts from some of the synagogues and homes that flooded, that they were going to be lost forever. So that's why we created the archive. And our mission, quite simply, is to collect, preserve, and make accessible the documents, the photographs, the artifacts, and the memories that tell the story of Jewish life in primarily Greater Houston, but all over the South Texas region, and I'll talk more about that in a second. We are housed at Rice University, and the Houston Jewish History Archive is a collaborative project between Rice University's program in Jewish Studies, of which I'm a faculty member, and the Woodson Research Center in Fondren Library, which is the home base for the archive. Most of our about 150 collections relate to Jewish life in Houston, but increasingly we've become involved in documenting Jewish life in other communities around South Texas. And you can see here a list of some of those: Galveston, Wharton, Beaumont, Baytown, Schulenburg, Victoria, Corpus Christi, and San Antonio. So we really are becoming involved in historical preservation of Jewish life throughout South Texas. In terms of what we do, most of what we do is try to acquire and preserve documents, photographs, audio recordings, videos, bowling trophies. We do have a bowling trophy, matchbooks, deli menus, anything that can help us unpack and tell the story of Jewish life in Houston or South Texas, how Texas Jews have, since the middle of the 19th century, tried to balance being both Jewish and Texan in some way. We are working as much as we can to digitize these records and make them available. And in a few minutes, I'll show you where those digital records are available online for you to access. We are now, in the time of COVID, doing more and more oral history work. Everyone's at home. So we've launched a Zoom oral history project, talking to Jewish Houstonians about not only their family history and background, but how the pandemic is affecting them and affecting their personal and professional lives. We sponsor a series of exhibits and lectures and public programs like this one. And we have a website and a Facebook page, and I hope soon we'll be on Twitter as well. In a nutshell, the kinds of things that we collect pertain to the Texas Jewish experience. If it isn't related to Texas in some way, or if it doesn't have a kind of a Jewish connection, then it falls outside of our collecting guidelines, and we wouldn't accept it. But that allows us to take in a pretty broad amount of material: scrapbooks, family photographs and diaries, Jewish life cycle memorabilia, confirmation photographs, bar and bat mitzvah photographs, wedding invitations and photographs, and so on and so forth. We've been working with a number of institutions, Jewish institutions in the Houston area: synagogues, the Jewish Community Center, Federation, Hadassah, BBYO to collect and preserve their organizational records. We also have a growing collection of material from Texas Jewish military veterans, things like dog tags, army papers, diaries, letters, memoirs, and things like that. We do accept artifacts into the collection on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, if you had Rabbi Henry Cohen's bicycle, right, the bicycle rode around Galveston, that would be tough for us to accept. I might send you to my good friend Kenneth Hoffman in New Orleans, who has display space for something like Rabbi Cohen's bicycle. And we do try to collect and preserve audio and video recordings, things like sermons, radio programs, cantorial music. We have examples of all of those things. As I said before, our home base is floor in a facility called the Wilson Research Center. This is the Special Collections Division. You would be able to come and visit. It's open to the public Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Obviously, these are anything but normal times. And so we're not welcoming visitors into our space at the moment, but hopefully, you know, in months to come, that will change. So while you can't come and visit us in person, here's where you can find us online. This is our website. Our website is about to undergo a total makeover, as you will, but I'll show you what it looks like right now. Before I show you the website, bear with me, guys. This is our digital scholarship archive. So all of the materials that we've digitized to date are available open access and download on this site. And I can, after this conversation is over, I can make these links distributable so that you don't have to frantically try to copy this down.
And Josh, I'm definitely going to want to find out what software and, you know, what platform y'all use for this digitization, because we're going to want to make our collection available too. So I'm going to come to you for help.
Sure, no worries. So this is where this lives. And then here's our homepage. I hope you can all see this. It tells you a little bit about who we are, why we started doing this work. And if you navigate to our website and you click on our LibGuide, this is a reasonably up-to-date listing of all of our collections. It's not complete, and we're constantly trying to update it. And you can see here that our collections are organized by categories. So individuals and families who've donated materials. So that listing is here. If you're from the Houston area or elsewhere in South Texas, you might see someone you know. Organizations and businesses. And I'll just, again, give you a peek. Synagogues that have donated their records to us in one form or another. And then a collection of rare books related to Texas Jewish history or Houston history. And then a personal favorite of mine, we actively search out and collect Texas Jewish cookbooks, right? These are cookbooks usually produced by Hadassah groups or synagogue sisterhoods. There's a lot you can learn from cookbooks. And actually a little bit later on tonight, we're gonna look at some Houston Jewish cookbooks to talk about Texas identity.
We're going to talk about brisket.
You know, you advertise that, and I told you I'm a vegetarian, so I have nothing of value to say.
This means more for me. That's fine.
Brisket. I have nothing of value to say about brisket or Texas barbecue. So that's the archive in a nutshell. It's really been, you know, creating a project like this totally from the ground up with volunteer support, community support, donor and foundation support. It's been really exciting, and I can't wait to see where the next couple of years take us.
Awesome. That's awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to spotlight me now. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to have a little conversation, ask Josh some questions and see what he thinks about a few things that I've been thinking about. And I will preface this with the fact that I was born in Houston at Methodist Hospital. And I have another connection, which is to the archive, which is that my dad went to Rice, and his name was Harvey, which was the name of the storm that led to the creation of the archive. So that means nothing, but I just thought I would mention that. I was born in Houston, but I moved when I was 3. So can I consider myself a Texan? I don't, and I wouldn't think anyone in Texas would. But what makes somebody a Texan? What makes somebody a Jew? What makes somebody a Southerner? These are the kinds of questions that I know we all think about when we're thinking about ourselves personally and when we're thinking about our communities. So otherwise you wouldn't be on this program right now. I wouldn't have the job I have. Josh wouldn't have the job he has. So we're all thinking people, and let's think about these things a little bit. And Josh, my first question to you is, what makes a Texas Jew?
What makes a Texas Jew? Well, first of all, I'm a Texas Jew, I guess, if we're going to talk credentials. I was born in Dallas. I grew up in San Antonio, and I've made my professional career here in Houston with the archive. So I guess I'm a Texas Jew, but there are a lot of ways of becoming a Texas Jew, and I think thinking about Texas Jewish identity. And I'm wondering if sometimes when we think about Southern Jewish identity, Southern Jewish history, I kind of get the feeling, and maybe I'm a little bit biased, that Texas, because we're on the western edge of the South, sometimes we kind of get left out of some of these narratives. So one of the things I want to do tonight is to kind of put Texas and the Texas Jewish experience back in the center, if you will, of how we think about Southern Jewish history. But before we do that, let's just talk about Texas for a minute. And because maps are helpful, let's look at a map of Texas. And this is instructive if we're thinking about Texas as a southern state or a western state. There's no conclusive answer here, right? Is Texas southern? Is Texas western? I took the liberty this week leading up to this talk of consulting with some of my friends and colleagues in the field, Brian Stone in Corpus Christi, Hollis Wiener in Fort Worth, and kind of asking them what they thought about Texas identity and Texas Jewish identity. And we'll kind of get to some of their thoughts along with mine later on. But if you look at a map of Texas and you see here, Interstate 35, right, starts at the border and snakes its way up north. And we can think about I-35 as a kind of dividing line in Texas, all right? On to the east of 35, that's where the major cities are, right? Dallas, San Antonio, Houston. And then to the west of it is in a lot of East Texas historically, plantains. I love plantains. I must be hungry. Plantations dotted the landscape, right? So in a lot of ways, East Texas didn't look all that different maybe from Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama in terms of the climate, in terms of the geography, and maybe also in terms of the politics. But if you move west of I-35, if you leave Fort Worth, you see in a lot of ways a totally different country, right? Cowboys and cattle country, mountains, desert. And so there's a lot of diversity within Texas, both geographically, politically, and economically. And that, I think that's important in unpacking Texas Jewish identity. We have to start by sort of unpacking Texas a little bit, because Texas is very Southern in a lot of ways, and it's very Western in a lot of ways. And to some extent, it depends on where in Texas you are.
So that's interesting. So you're saying that like we start at the base, which is geography, basically, right? What the geography, anybody, whatever religion they are, wherever they're from, when they come to a land, everyone's equal in the eyes of geography, right? If there's water there, then you grow rice, and if there's not water there, then you have cattle. Or I mean, so geography really is one of the fundamental determinants of what happens in your environment.
I think you could say that, and that's one of the reasons why local and regional history matters, and why I think we can't, so often, as and I'm sure many of the people on this call know, is that, historically, those who write American Jewish history have taken the New York Jewish experience as axiomatic, right, as representative of the Jewish experience as a whole. And the reason that I have a job and you have a job and the Southern Jewish Historical Society exists is to some extent, right, to sort of counteract that narrative. Now, on the one hand, we find a lot of parallels between Jewish life in the South and Jewish life elsewhere. And there is a really interesting strain of thought, which is that, Texas life in Jewish life in Texas, that is to say, and Jewish life in the South may not be all that different from Jewish life in other so-called far-flung places, right? Far away from the centers of densely populated Jewish life, right? Jerusalem, Warsaw, once upon a time, New York City. So there may be some patterns that sort of transcend geography, but I think geography and local history are really important, and there's a lot of things that we can illuminate if we decide to pay attention.
So that's interesting because a lot of, we've been working with a lot of different scholars, and everyone recognizes that there are stories to tell about Southern Jewish history, but there are some differences of opinion as to how different Southern Jewish history is. There's a Mark Bauman on one side, who might say maybe some of this is a little overdone. Even though he's an expert in Southern Jewish history, he sees many, many similarities, cultural similarities that are Jewish, that are maintained by Southern Jews, that fit in with what we think of as that New York or that Northern Jewish identity. So there are no right or wrong answers, although when someone writes a book about it, they think that that's the right answer, but then someone else can come along and write another book. So so what are some characteristics, would you say, of Texas Jewry? Or is that even a fair question?
I'm gonna answer that question by looking at characteristics of Southern Jewish history and using the Texas Jewish experience to comment on it in a number of ways. Let's see. Here's my own personal take on major themes in Southern Jewish history. I'm sure many of these themes are the ones that are the building blocks of the narrative of your museum. And at every turn, I think we'll see tonight that Texas Jewish history has something to comment on and something to contribute to this idea. So the first idea in Southern Jewish history, those of us who know the literature, or those of us who grew up here, this will be a familiar idea, right? The notion of migration to a distant land of opportunity. Jews came to the Southern United States. If you wanted to be cute, you could go as far back as the descendants of conversos, right, who came to Texas in the late 1500s, who hid their Jewish identity and were subsequently persecuted by the Inquisition, and some of them were killed. But to some extent, right, Jews have come here seeking, above all, economic opportunity, right? For much of the narrative of Southern Jewish history, this was not a place that you came to become more religious, right? To deepen your connection to Judaism, although certainly that's happened, right? This was a place that you came to. It was the frontier. You came here to try to make a living. And this is the quick story of Louis Levy, who was one of the first Jewish Houstonians. And he settled here in the middle of the 19th century, and he wanted to encourage more Jews to come and join him here in Houston. So he publishes this editorial in an American Jewish newspaper called the Asmonean out of New York in June of 1850. And it's an ad, effectively, telling Jews around the world, come to Texas. It's great. He writes, in our own state, thousands of acres of land can be bought within the settled portions of the state for the small sum of from 25 cents to $1 per acre. Good, arable, fertile land where a man can make his living to his liking, and more independent than the autocrat of Russia or the emperor of Austria themselves. Indeed, I would not exchange my 15-acre lot with the house on it and the garden around it, which I possess near the city of Houston, for all thrones and hereditary dominions of both those noted persons. For we will see if we live, who will have a shelter of their own 15 years from now. And he goes on, but we don't have time. But the point is that Texas and the American South offered Jewish immigrants, primarily from Central and then Eastern Europe, a chance at economic opportunity that they didn't have back home, right? And so that's a narrative that runs through Texas Jewish history, and it runs through, I think, all of Southern Jewish history as well. And one other quick place that you noted, I'm going to show you all tonight. This is a really cool pamphlet that we acquired here at the archive from a rare Judaica bookseller in New York City. And it's a pamphlet that was connected to the Galveston movement, which, if you were here for the Jewish Texas history pub trivia at the beginning of the program, there was a question about Rabbi Henry Cohen. This was the pamphlet that they printed and distributed in Eastern Europe to try to convince shtetl Jews to get on that boat and come to Texas, and from Texas perhaps to elsewhere in the American hinterland. And here, as part of this pamphlet, they got to sell Yiddish-speaking Jews on Texas. It's 1907. What the heck is Texas? So here are pages of description of what Texas is like. And my friend Maurice Wolfthal translated this Yiddish pamphlet, so you don't have to be a Yiddish speaker to know what's going on here. And he wrote, the state of Texas is the largest of all the United States. It occupies over 200,000 English square miles, is larger than all of France. It has fertile soil, great for grazing cattle and cotton plants, except for its southern section. Its climate is good for your health. Being a Houstonian, I always laugh at that, right? Especially in the winter months. And he talks about how diverse the state is, right? There's Englishmen and Spaniards and Germans and Frenchmen, and he uses the word Negroes, we'll say African Americans, Native Americans, and others. And he ends, the state still has lots of empty space for new immigrants. So again, this idea of Texas as the land of opportunity, but also the frontier, a place that's wide open. It's not New York. It's not Ellis Island. It's not the Lower East Side, which, again, if you know the whole motivation behind the Galveston movement, you know what they're getting at here, right? It's Texas, not New York, that offers the best chance at success for the Jewish immigrant.
Well,
So,
and I'll just break in here that this is the way that institutions can really work together, because Josh turned us on at the museum to a woman who has her, I don't know how many great grandfathers it is, but a trunk, an immigrant steamer trunk that he came over from Europe with and came through the port of Galveston. So Josh didn't have a place for it in his archive, so he connected us with that potential donor, and that potential donor is now a donor of that artifact, and that will be on display in our exhibit about Galveston. So thank you very much once again, Josh.
no, sure, it was my pleasure. Like you said, it's really great when we can all work together to kind of preserve these stories and these artifacts. Yeah, so let's keep going. So what are some of the other big themes in Southern Jewish history, and what does the Texas Jewish experience have to say about it? Kenneth mentioned Jewish merchants, right? At the time that Jews are finding their way to Texas, admittedly in small numbers, they're coming as part of a much larger wave of European migration. And if you know Texas, you know that if you drive from Houston, where I live now, to San Antonio, where I grew up, you'll pass all these towns with German and Czech names, right? Weimar and New Braunfels, and so on and so forth, right? Those are the towns that were established by these non-Jewish German and Czech immigrants. They came to Texas to farm. Jews came to Texas to sell them stuff, to put it in a kind of a crude, humorous way. And not all of them, but many of them became these giants of retail in American economic history, right? Neiman Marcus, Zales is a Texas Jewish success story. Sakowitz, we have a bit of a Sakowitz collection here in the archive. Star Furniture is a Houston Jewish furniture company. Of course, there were others. Everyone remembers Fingers if you're from this area. And then, of course, the grocery business, with Weingarten's being probably the classic example of that. So Jews came here and they found that economic opportunity and really, in a profound way, contributed to the development of Texas's economy in this sense. And I think the story, again, is true whether we're talking about Texas or Louisiana or other states across the South. But this is, again, one of the other ways in which I think the Texas Jewish experience, while I think it is distinctive in some ways, and I'll get to that before we close, parallels very closely the Southern Jewish story. And so if I have an argument tonight, it's that you can't tell the Southern Jewish story without Texas. That's my piece.
So let me ask you this question. The Texas shares a very long border with Mexico. Texas used to be Mexico. Before that, it was New Spain. I mean, so there is a Latino history and culture wrapped within a lot of Texas history. How does that spill over or manifest itself in Texas Jewry?
That's a great question. And I was going to address this a little bit later on, but I'm glad that you brought it up. I think that this ultimately, right, if we want to make a ledger of all the things that the Texas Jewish experience has in common with the other Southern states, I think the history of Texas's connection to Spain and Mexico, and the story of those descendants of conversos who came here in the late 1500s. They didn't establish any kind of lasting Jewish community. They didn't have synagogues, right? They had to hide their Jewish identity to avoid being captured and killed. But I think it's an important touchstone for the Texas Jewish community, particularly because we have such a large contingent of Spanish-speaking Jews in our communities, especially if you look at San Antonio and at the Jewish communities in the Valley, right? I'm thinking of McAllen, I'm thinking of Harlingen, where it's not at all uncommon to hear Spanish when you go to synagogue. And my own experience, if I can just speak, personally for a minute, this is my family story. My family came to Texas from Mexico City in 1960. My father's grandparents left Eastern Europe and could not come to the United States at the end of the 1920s because of the harsh immigration quotas, and Mexico took them in. So my grandparents met and got married in Mexico City, and they came to San Antonio in 1960. And so my own narrative is a testament to this. I grew up, Spanish was my father's first language. And on our Seder table, growing up, we put guacamole on our matzah. There was, jalapeno in the matzah ball soup. And I just sort of took it for granted as, you know, something that you did. I didn't think of my experience as being particularly distinctive or unique until I left Texas and saw, you know, the rest of the world. But if you had to, you know, pin me down and ask me, you know, what's one of the things that makes Texas Jewry different? Maybe not unique, because certainly we can find Spanish-speaking Jews in California, in Florida, in New Mexico, in Arizona, all over the country. But in terms of, you know, being a subgroup that has strength in numbers, I think that's one of the things that makes Texas Jewish history distinctive. And this really leads us into a conversation about how we as Texas Jews and as Southerners, you know, learn Southern Jewish identity. Because, you know, identity, as I think we all know, is not something that you're born with, right? It's something that you have to learn and adapt to. And one of the other themes in Southern Jewish history is the theme of adaptation and acculturation, right? Immigrants coming here from German-speaking lands and later Yiddish-speaking lands, and acclimating in various ways to Southern life, and especially to Texas life. And one of the best ways to illustrate that, I'm sure you have some of this in the museum in some way, is to look at what Texas Jews eat. This is the oldest cookbook in our collection. This is a Jewish cookbook from Beth Israel of Houston, which was published in 1911. And you only have to go a few pages in before you will find a recipe for how to cook and serve a possum dinner. Not kidding. I have not tried to recreate it yet. I'm not particularly eager to. But there it is, right? When in Rome, as they say. When in Texas, you gotta learn to eat Texan. This, of course, you know, lives on today, not so much in possum dinners, but in touchstone community events. The Kosher Chili Cook-Off is a signature part of Texas Jewish life. They have one in Dallas. They have one in Houston. I don't know if they have one in San Antonio or Austin. They may, right? But this is the perfect blending, if you will, of the Texas and the Jewish, right? Because not only are we making chili, we're making kosher chili. So we're using different ingredients, perhaps. Everything is being, you know, checked by a mashgiach, by a kosher supervisor. And people, at least here in Houston, I'm sure it's the same in Dallas, people from different branches of the community all sort of come together to celebrate being Texan and Jewish in this way every year. One more example, maybe too quick, and then we'll pause again for comments or questions. This is a t-shirt, a commemorative t-shirt from a barbecue that the Shereth Israel Synagogue in Wharton, Texas. This is a small town Jewish community that sadly no longer really exists. But they used to hold this barbecue fundraiser every year. And here, right, food was an opportunity for Jews and Gentiles to interact, because even though it was a synagogue fundraiser, it was open to the whole community. And if you talk to people from Wharton, they'll tell you that Gentiles would come. They had kosher chickens. They had non-kosher chickens. I'm told that the coleslaw recipe was put in a safe deposit box somewhere, and is apparently still like top secret. We don't have a copy of the coleslaw recipe in the archive yet.
Something to shoot for.
Something to shoot for. One last cool food thing, and then we're gonna step out and maybe take some comments or questions. And that is this really fun guacamole recipe that I found in a cookbook from the Galveston chapter of the National Council for Jewish Women in our cookbook collection here in the archive. Here's a recipe for guacamole. And what are the things you notice when you look at this recipe, besides the cute avocados and sombreros dancing, is that we have to explain what guacamole is, because it's 1950 and Tex-Mex cuisine has not yet, you know, become commercialized, right? To the point where you can, buy prepackaged, pre-made guacamole at the store. So what is guacamole and what do I do with it? So here's not only a recipe, but explanations. Use it as a cocktail spread, using Fritos to dip in, right? The ultimate Texas chip. So this recipe to me, right, which otherwise would be a throwaway, page in an otherwise book of interesting recipes, says a lot about how Jews in Texas and Jews elsewhere in the South have to learn how to be Texan, right? And one of the ways that you learn identity is through food.
Excellent, great points. And I want to comment just briefly the idea about the Spanish-speaking Jews of Mexico, of Spain, of Texas. It reminds me in my part of the South, in South Louisiana, there were a lot of Alsatian Jewish immigrants, came from the Alsace-Lorraine area between Germany and France. Sometimes it was Germany, sometimes it was France, but when these folks came over, it was French-speaking. And Louisiana was a natural place for them to come because Louisiana has a very, a very proud and long French history and a Spanish history. As a matter of fact, we were Spanish for as long as we were French, but we call it the French Quarter. We don't call it the Spanish Quarter. And that reminds us that the American story includes things that weren't America when America started. Some of the South was in the original 13 colonies, right? Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. But all the rest of the South was not, well, by the end of the war, by the end of the Revolutionary War, it was British, up to the Mississippi River. But Oklahoma and Arkansas and Louisiana and Texas, there were parts that were colonial for someone else, not colonial for the British. And so it just helps us to remember that we really are a very unique country that is made up of colonies from lots of other countries, indigenous people who were brought over here against their will and enslaved, and then immigrants from all over who come and populate our communities. And that's who we are today, all of those things together. So I just wanted to, that's something that makes me happy to think about and to explore. So go on.
No, I think that's a really neat point, right? And I think that outsiders don't always think of the South as being a diverse place for a whole number of reasons, right? Whether it's political bias or geographical bias, we're incredibly diverse. Houston, New Orleans, and recognizing that diversity and weaving it into the story of how we tell our history, I think is really important. We haven't really talked about politics yet. There's a lot we can say about Southern Jews in politics and about Texas Jews in politics. I think, though, that another of the key themes, if we're going to kind of create a laundry list of topics in Southern Jewish history and see how Texas fits, would be political leadership at the local and at the state level. A lot of folks are surprised to find out that Jews had a much easier, or maybe we should say quicker, ability to get engaged in political leadership outside of the Northeast. Right? You find Jewish mayors and councilmen in the South much earlier on the whole than you find them in the Northeast. And Texas, of course, is no exception to that. There's a whole list of Jews who have been mayors of Texas cities that I could have pulled from. I chose one of the most recent, Annette Strauss of Dallas, and also legendary figures in Texas politics, Babe Schwartz of Galveston, who served in the Texas State Senate for decades. And then you knew it was coming. You didn't know where, but you knew it was coming. we have KINKY Friedman. Not yet our governor, but there's still time.
I've got that poster and it's signed by him.
Oh, well, I hope it's the first thing you see when you walk into the museum.
No.
We have a poster somewhere in our collection as well. And then we get collections from individuals and families, and somebody had a signed note. You can see it here on the screen that she'd gotten from KINKY. He did a book tour. I think he came to the JCC Book Fair in Houston, and he signed a note to her on a piece of paper, and he wrote, "Carol, thank you for being an American. Best wishes, KINKY Friedman." So we love that. There's a whole other conversation we could have here about the political persuasions of Southern Jews. I'm not going to go there tonight, but it is an interesting topic to think about, and if that makes Texas Jews distinct from Southerners or Southern Jews distinct from Jews in other parts of the country. I want to keep going with a couple of these, and then maybe we can pull back, and then hopefully there'll be some time for Q&A. I don't know if when we have a hard stop at 8 o'clock or 8:15.
That's in 3 minutes. So why don't you give us another 5-6 minutes and then we'll do Q&A.
See what we can do. So moving a little faster, right? Thinking about the primacy of interfaith relations. I think one of the things that makes the Southern Jewish experience unique is being Jewish in the Bible Belt, which on the one hand, I think overall has led to an unusual degree of tolerance of Jews and Judaism as being the people of the Old Testament. Obviously, there's a flip side to that, right? A narrative about trying to convert Jews, about arguing that Jews are subject to eternal damnation. And so Jews in the South, I'm going to argue, maybe more so than Jews elsewhere, have felt a strong need to engage in interfaith relations, right? To have Jewish-Christian dialogue. And Texas is no exception to that, right? So you can see here from a Congregation Emmanuel Houston, a bulletin here from 1945. They used to do something called pulpit swaps, right? So ministers would come give the sermon in synagogues and temples Friday night, and then the rabbi would go speak in church on Sunday. And then the idea of the Southern rabbi and the Texas rabbi as a kind of representative to the local Christian community. This is a phenomenon we see over and over and over again in Texas Jewish history and in Southern Jewish history, whether we're talking about probably the most famous Texas rabbi of all, Rabbi Henry Cohen of Galveston, but then also in these sort of smaller and more maybe far-flung communities like Wharton, Texas, where Rabbi Israel Rosenberg was the community's Jewish representative for many, many years. And then, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, Kenneth, we have to talk about living as whites in the segregated South and Jews' historical relationship to African Americans going back to the time of slavery through the civil rights movement and beyond. And it's a nuanced story. It's a story that when we look back on it, when we retell it, obviously there are moments that we can be very proud of. And this is one of those, right? This is Rabbi Moshe Kahana of Brit Shalom here in Houston, marching in Selma for African-American civil rights. But there's another narrative that we need to also be cognizant of, and that is illustrated by this photograph, which is of the first sit-in here in Houston, which took place at a Weingarten's supermarket lunch counter back in March of 1960. So there's a lot of history here to kind of dig into, and it's a very, as I said, nuanced story, but I think one that many of us, especially in light of recent events on the national stage, are thinking about again in new ways. And then finally, I know I said that would be the last one, but this is an important theme too. And that is the idea of an old South and a new South. And what I mean by that is the small towns, the Jewish immigrants who came here, many of them with nothing, and they set up shop in these tiny, tiny destinations because it was near the river or it was near a railroad junction. And they opened up the general stores or the clothing store or the grocery store or the jewelry store in that town. And
And they
then,
were oftentimes called the Jew store
right,
by the
right.
locals.
Yeah, and there's a great book about this.
Mhm.
And as we all know, right, that old Jewish South has been in decline now for a generation or more for a number of reasons. And so this narrative of decline and disappearance is true of small town Texas Jewish life. It's true of small town Southern Jewish life. But then on the other hand, you have the rise of what my colleague Stuart Rockoff calls the New South. Right? The southern major cities, their Jewish populations are booming. Dallas, look at this, 75,000 Jews. Houston, just over 50,000. 25,000 in Austin. 10,000 in San Antonio, where I'm from. And we can talk about Memphis and Nashville and
Atlanta.
Miami, Atlanta, of course. And Miami is in the category almost all to itself. And this growth is fueled, right, not by Texas Jewish families having a lot of babies. It's fueled by migration from other places. It's fueled by migration from the Northeast, from the Midwest, from Israel, from the former Soviet Union, and in the case of Texas in particular, from Mexico and from South America. So that's been a really exciting trend to follow. Just wrapping up, again, if we were going to think about maybe some of the ways in which the Texas Jewish experience doesn't fit the Southern pattern, because most of my argument tonight has been that not only does it fit, it might be the best example. But there might be a few ways in which it doesn't. And one of these we alluded to before, the fact that you have a vital subgroup of Spanish-speaking Jews in Texas Jewish communities today. There's also a large migration of Jews from South Africa that came here in the 1970s and 1980s. That may also be true of Atlanta and true of some other communities, but it's one of the things that, again, I noticed growing up in San Antonio and I see in Houston, and I definitely haven't noticed in the other Jewish communities I've lived in the Northeast and the Midwest.
My cousin Jonathan came to Houston in the 80s from South Africa. So there you go.
Yeah. Two more quick points. One of them is something, again, that I've only kind of recently noticed. And that is that in Texas Jewish life today, Zionism seems to be incredibly central to the communal sense of Judaism. No matter where you fall on the religious spectrum, from Reform to Orthodox, and even no matter where your politics lie, Zionism seems to be still the glue that kind of holds Texas Jewish identity together in a way that I don't think it is anymore in other parts of the country. So is that true just for Texas? Is that true of other Southern Jewish communities today? That's something worth, I think, looking into and thinking about. And then finally is this thing that you can't put your finger on it, but you know it's there. And that is something that I just call the Texas mystique. This idea that Texas is a whole other country unto itself, a special place. And if you are from Texas, if you were born in Texas, or you got to Texas as soon as you could, as the saying goes, that there's just something, it may be undefinable, but it's unique and it's special. You know, maybe it's a sense of rebelliousness and a sense of independence, that no one can tell us what to do, a sense that our opinions and experience matter more than anyone else's. I don't know how else to define it, but I know it's there. So I'm curious to hear what you guys think. And with whatever time we have left, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation so far.
Absolutely. Well, let me respond just to a couple of things. First of all, I think bigness is a big part of Texas identity, right? You guys, if y'all were Rhode Island, I'm not sure if it would be a whole other country. I don't know. Maybe it would. Maybe there's someone from Rhode Island who can speak to that. But I'll also say, just going back, I wanted to say one thing about when you said about the interfaith relationships and how important that was. I have found when I was writing my master's thesis on the town of Port Gibson, Mississippi, this is back in the early 90s, I found a letter that the congregation wrote to raise money to build a synagogue, and they sent it out to other congregations. And the letter said, our Christian neighbors think that all we care about is our businesses. Help us raise money to build a synagogue so that we can have a place of worship, and it's for our children's sake, they say. And it's really interesting. So living in the Bible Belt in this very religious part of the country, this very, in a lot of ways, fundamentalist or evangelical part of the country, Jews become more Southern by becoming more Jewish. Because everyone else is religious, everyone else has a church. Why don't we have a church? We better have a church too, because that's what everyone does. So it's an interesting interplay, I think, of geography and culture and religion. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. So questions. How do we want to go about asking questions? A couple of questions got sent in to us earlier, and one of them was about El Paso, and we haven't really talked about El Paso, and I've got an aunt and an uncle out in El Paso. And I've been there, and it's a great place. And the question was, why did Jews move to El Paso? Do you have an idea? Do you have an answer?
Yeah, no, we haven't talked about El Paso a whole lot, except to sort of point it out at the very sort of western edge of that other Texas, right? Jews came to El Paso for many of the same reasons that they went everywhere else that they went, right? El Paso is on the border. El Paso was, the place to import goods from Mexico. And once it was connected to the rest of the country by the railroad, it became incredibly important. El Paso has an interesting Jewish history. And I don't know how familiar you are with this, or how familiar the viewer.
My grandfather was the rabbi there.
His grandfather was the rabbi in El Paso.
Who's speaking?
Carl Zalanka, Tampa.
Oh yeah, I've heard from you.
Yes,
That's
you have.
great.
Yes, my grandfather came there in 1900 to be the rabbi of Temple Mount Sinai.
And he
was the only rabbi between El Paso and Los Angeles.
We've got a Zalanka on this call. That's amazing. It's
That
nice
is
to meet you.
his grandfather founded B'nai B'rith in Mexico.
That's great. Thank you so much for speaking up. Zalanka is a really fascinating and wonderful historical figure. There's a great book. I'm not going to get any commission for selling these books. And if people want to know, like, what are the best books to read on Texas Jewish history, we can do that. But there's a book by a historian her name is Libby Garland, and she wrote a book called After They Closed the Gates, and it's a book
You froze.
states from the 1920s to the 1960s. And it turns out, much to our surprise, that Jews, when they couldn't come in here legally, we snuck across the border just like everybody else, with fake papers and fake identities, and in the trunks of cars and all kinds of stuff. And El Paso was one of the places where Jews tried to do this. Tried to sneak over from Mexico into Texas. And when they did that, they became Rabbi Zalanka of El Paso's Passion Project. And there's a whole really interesting story there about how Rabbi Zalanka tried to help those Jewish immigrants who were, desperate to make it into America. He sort of felt like they should really make a go of it in Mexico because of the quota laws, and he didn't want Jews to be seen as contravening the law at a time when anti-Semitism was really running rampant. But El Paso and Rabbi Zalanka have a really interesting Jewish history.
Hey, Carol Cantor, did you want to ask a question?
Well, my grandmother, Fanny Slabowski, it was in El Paso, and her husband was one of the founders of the synagogue in El Paso. And at UTEP, right now there is amazing archive of the files, the actual files of the stories of the immigrants, and it's available online. It's amazing stories, and so many of them will break your heart. But we went there and we actually met with Josh in Houston on our genealogical adventure, and it was amazing.
I
Awesome.
just want you to know that, I'm sorry, that I have a question in the chat box if you're interested in it.
Yes, and this is who are you?
Diane
But that is
Statham.
not available to the whole group.
I'm sorry.
Right, I know. It came to me, and now I'm looking through it because I've got all these things here. What? Just say your question.
Right. Particularly here in Houston, it seems to me that the Jewish population of this city, vis-a-vis Dallas, is smaller, despite the fact that we're a bigger city than Dallas. The Jewish population is smaller than Dallas's population. And I think one of the issues is the boom and bust cycle of the oil and gas industry. And I'm just wondering if that's a reasonable perception.
Well, I'll say, I grew up in Baton Rouge, and Baton Rouge has a huge Exxon refinery and other refineries, big port, much like Houston, except not nearly as big. And as I was growing up, we always had Jews in town who were from, worked for one of the petrochemical industries, and they would move from Baytown to Baton Rouge up to New Jersey and back over the years, and we were always sorry to see them go because they were very intelligent and very involved in the community. And so and then in the mid 80s, when things really went bust, a lot of people moved away. So I can say that about Baton Rouge. I don't know about Houston, but I'm guessing it's the same thing. Josh?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it also maps onto a larger question, which is that, Houston is the fourth largest city in the United States, and Houston's Jewish community isn't anywhere close to being the fourth largest Jewish community in the United States. I think Houston is something like 32nd on the list if you were going to rank Jewish communities by size. So we're sort of right in the middle, not small, but not nearly as big as we ought to be. And not even nearly as big as Dallas, as I pointed out earlier, and as you mentioned. I think that the fact that we are here in Houston, that one of our major economic engines, not the only one, because we also have the medical center, which has been a big draw for bringing Jews to Houston, and NASA, which has been a draw for bringing Jewish engineers, is that for a period of time, Jews had a bit of a rough go finding work in the oil and gas industry, because a lot of the oil and gas industry involves cooperation with countries in the Middle East, and there was some anti-Semitism to contend there. So I'm curious. This is something that I've heard. I'm not going to state it as fact, but I'm wondering the extent to which historically that might have contributed to the fact that Houston's Jewish community maybe isn't as large as Dallas is. But if you have other ideas, I'd certainly love to hear them.
All right. So there is a question that is general Southern Jewish, not Texas Southern Jewish, and it comes from David. And he asks that during the Civil War, how did Southern Jews reconcile fighting for the South when philosophically Jews were against slavery? I'll take some exception with the fact that maybe Jews weren't always philosophically against slavery, particularly those who owned slaves, which David points out. So we're going back more in time than talking about, late 20th century, going back to the 19th century. Josh, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, it's an interesting question, because when we talk about Jews and slave ownership, there's two myths that we have to cut through. And the first is one that we tell ourselves as Jews, and the second is one that is sometimes told about us. And the myth that we tell about ourselves is that, a people that experienced so much historical oppression, a people, according to the Bible, born in slavery, effectively, right? How could we have turned around and enslaved another people, right? How could we possibly have done that, right? There's no way the Jews could have owned slaves. And that turns out not to be true. There's a lot of scholarship on Jewish slave ownership. And what it shows is that while Jews did not at all dominate the slave trade, as we're sometimes accused of doing by certain groups, Jews did participate in buying and selling slaves and owning slaves. And the best scholarship on this topic estimates that about 25% of Jews in the South on the eve of the Civil War owned slaves. But at some points in Southern history, the percentage was much higher, as high as about 3/4 of the Jewish families in places like Charleston and Richmond earlier in the 19th century may have owned slaves. And for the most part, as far as we can tell, didn't feel bad about it. One of the themes of our evening tonight is that wherever Jews live, they adapt and acculturate to the norms of that place. And part of living in the South, living in Texas or living in Alabama or Mississippi, meant acclimating to racial codes and to ideas about African Americans. There certainly were individual Jews who may have felt that slavery was wrong. You can see this, in fact, if you look in the wills of Jews. There are wills of Jews. There's a famous one of a Jew in Virginia who, in his will, outlined the terms in which his slaves would be freed upon his death. So you do see that, but we don't have overwhelming evidence that that Jews felt that slavery was wrong, that Jews participated in the abolitionist movement in large numbers. For them, it was a part of life, no different than making a living or going to synagogue. It was just something that everybody did.
Well, and what's interesting, I'll add the thought that you say that wherever Jews went, they acculturated and adapted. Everywhere they went, where they were allowed to, which is really interesting, because in the shtetl, in the Pale of Settlement, in certain German states, they weren't allowed necessarily to be in the guilds, to own land, to join into the cultural aspects of their country. But this is America. And in America, even though there are impediments, social impediments, and there can be anti-Semitism, but in America, Jews were able to fit into whatever communities they moved to. And that is the fascinating thing about Southern Jewish history, is American history. We like to talk about our differences and our uniqueness, and there definitely are differences and uniquenesses, but we have to remember that it's all part of our American history. You can't talk about American history without talking about the South. And so Jews in the South are part of the American story. So I just always like to give a plug to that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, who is this speaking?
Judy Steinberg.
Hey, Judy, right here in New Orleans.
Yeah, are you all aware that in the 50s there was a television show, it was like 20 Mule Team Borax, and they had stories from the West, and they had done, one of the episodes was on Rabbi Cohen.
Really?
And I didn't know if you could get hold of it. The reason I was still in school at the time and living at home. And I remember my mother saying to me that her grandparents' house in Galveston was one of the places that Rabbi Cohen would bring the immigrants to stay when they first landed. But I remember very clearly that it must have been in the 50s.
Do you,
They had that show.
you don't happen to remember what, I can look this up, what network had that show?
I have no earthly, it had to be CBS or NBC or ABC. There wasn't any other choice.
That's right. That's right.
So,
I'll-
although it could have been PBS, although I don't think
It
San
might-
Antonio had a PBS station at that point.
May
Yeah.
I interject, please? It was a PBS series, The Jews of the South, and I believe it was either in the 1960s or 70s.
Oh.
And I'm sure that, the tapes are still on archive somewhere.
Okay, now this show was not in the 60s or 70s because I was already not living in San Antonio then.
Well, then this must have been a different series.
It was
but
probably a different series, and I'm pretty sure it was. But this was 20. In fact, I think at one point Ronald Reagan was the narrator or the host of the show. So it was a long time ago. But it was an interesting show, and that particular one obviously was very interesting.
That
I'm going to
sounds
mute
great.
myself again now, Ken.
Josh.
I'm gonna look it
Hi,
up.
it's
We
Paul Katz.
we
The
are.
name of the show was called Death Valley Days.
That's a cherry title. Thank you.
That's exactly right. It was called Death Valley Days.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to look that up. But we are at a stopping point now. But I want to let's see if I can do this one last thing, which is to share my screen. That ain't gonna work. Get in touch with us. Josh, put up your email again if you've got it. And I'm going to give you my email, everybody. So while Josh is doing that, get out your pencils to write down my email. It's very simple. Kenneth, KENNETH @MSJE.org. Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience.org. Email me with your questions, with your stories. If you want to support the museum, I'll love you either way. But we'd love for you to support the museum. Go to our website, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on Facebook. Josh, tell them how they can get in contact with you.
Okay, sure. So if you Google Houston Jewish History Archive, you'll find us. We also have a Facebook page, and as I said, I'm hoping in the next couple of weeks to get us on Twitter. If you wanted to ask me a question about tonight's program or find out about how to donate materials to us, if you have a South Texas Jewish connection, here's my email, jf36@rice.edu. My phone number, 713-348-3418. And again, we're the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice. And it has been an unbelievable pleasure to spend an hour and a half with you this evening. And Kenneth, I'm so grateful for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you, Josh. Thank everyone for participating. We had 100 people on earlier on Zoom and 50 people on Facebook. So you guys are wonderful, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
All right. Bye-bye.
You guys are wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you all.